Hi, I'm Shashank Bhargav, and you're listening to Three Things, the Indian Express news show. On Saturday, Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman presented the 12th Union Budget under the government led by Prime Minister Narendra Modi.
Honourable Speaker, I present the budget for 25-26. This budget continues our government's efforts to A. Accelerate growth, B. Secure inclusive development, C. Invigorate private sector investments, D. Uplift household sentiments, and E. Enhance spending power of India's rising middle class.
Now, this budget, as we'll discuss later, was presented at a time when India has been struggling to grow at the rate it really wants to. After introducing reforms like GST and implementing various ease of doing business measures in the past, the government this time provided an unprecedented tax break to the middle class, hoping it would finally boost India's economy.
I am now happy to announce that there will be no income tax payable up to income of 12 lakh rupees.
To understand the implications of this and what it could mean for India's growth story, we are joined by the Indian Express's Udit Misra. Now, Udit, before we unpack this budget, we should begin by discussing the challenge that the finance minister was facing. And we mentioned before how India has been struggling to grow at the rate it wants to. And this has actually been the case for some time now. So tell us how this challenge was different from the ones that the finance minister has faced in the past.
Okay, so the essential problem facing the economy and the finance minister Nirmala Sitharaman was that from her standpoint, the government had done everything it could do to push India to a higher growth level. The GDP growth rate has been stagnating at something like less than 5% since 2019 and less than 6% since 2014. So the broader thing is that these numbers, while they might be world-beating numbers or, compare quite favorably from, say, other economies, within India's context, these are fairly moderate numbers. These are not the numbers that which will help us become a rich country or even a middle-income country very quickly. So that was the essential concern. Now, what the finance minister has done or the government has done in the past few years is that they have, focused on cleaning up the balance sheet of banks. Banks were laden with a lot of NPAs. They have ensured that, the government's capital expenditure ramps up. So government is spending more and more on building roads and railways and, ports. And they have also given a corporate tax cut, which is to incentivize companies to come and really invest new capacities. But in all of these measures, despite all of these measures, and partly also because of some external shocks like the COVID or the Russia-Ukraine war, the end result was that the economy was still not reaching the next level of growth rate. And unemployment or poor job creation or low-paying jobs was a continuous problem.
Yeah, and we've talked about it in the past that India has been facing two big problems. One is that people are not spending enough. And so the government, like you said, it had invested a lot in capital expenditure, which would create jobs and give money into the hands of people. And the other problem has been that the private sector has not been investing. Companies are not opening new firms or ventures. And their logic is that, people are not spending, so why should we start something new or manufacture more things? And in that regard, the government had given a corporate tax cut in 2019. But again, the private sector did not really do anything.
Yes. And so the essential challenge before the finance minister was this: how to trigger the virtuous process of growth. You have all the ingredients for a very high, fast growing economy in this country. You have abundant labor force. You have a very, vibrant economy. You have the government spending on capital expenditure. You have a big private sector. You have internal demand for goods and services. It's a young country. It wants different things. And you have a very strong government, so there is no problem that, there is a policy paralysis. So from the outside, you would wonder that why is this not then, getting to another level of growth? From the outside, you could also say that 6% is a good number, but one must always remember that even when US grows at 2%, it adds like 3-4 times more in a year than what we add when we grow at 6%, because we're a smaller economy. So India has to grow at much faster. As I often say, our required run rate is much higher. They are playing a different match. They have already reached a certain stage. We haven't. So we have to always keep that in mind. And this applies to China also. We often compare ourselves with China. We should not be, because they're almost 5-6 times our size. So this was the essential crux, that how to shift the economy to another level of growth rate. And the problem was stuck at the fact that people were not consuming more. There are reasons to why people were not consuming more. But if we start from people were not consuming more, that led to the notion that despite all the incentives being in their favor, corporate were not investing more, because, they were saying that until unless we see enough growth in consumption, we will not invest. So this budget has tried to provide a solution to that problem of people not consuming more.
Right. And when we talk about the state of the economy, you mentioned how jobs have been low. And we also understand that the household debt, which includes personal loans, agricultural loans, home loans, they are at an all-time high. From 37.9% in the financial year 23, it is now 41% of the GDP. And we've also had a situation that when counting employment, even the self-employed were being counted as employed, which is not the same thing, because you don't have that kind of stable income in self-employment. And at this time, when India was facing this problem, some people said that, perhaps the solution is that the government should give a tax break to the people. And that way, instead of giving that money to the government, the people could keep that money and hopefully spend it. And then that will give a boost to the economy.
Yes, so this goes back to the notion of what was leading to the slowdown in the Indian economy. And a lot of people thought that it was a consumption-led slowdown. And in 2019, the corporate tax cut was a supply-side reform, not a consumption solution. And that is why for the last 5-6 years, the finance minister has been exasperated, asking why isn't the private sector investing? And this time, the finance minister said, okay, let me give a consumption boost. Let me try to target the consumption part of the equation and cut income tax in a way that frankly has not been seen. It's a historic, massive cut. It's a bonanza of unprecedented proportions.
Yeah, and what the government has now said is that people earning up to 12 lakh rupees will not be required to pay income tax. Can you just put this into context? How big of a tax cut is this?
Yeah, so this is quite remarkably massive tax cut. You have to understand that in India, the average income of an Indian is something like 2,20,000 or 2,10,000, thereabout. Now, many of our listeners will have to spend a moment to understand what that means. So we are a fairly poor country. And the tax cut right now suggests that up till 12 lakhs, nobody will have to pay any money. So that is 6 times the average income. Now, just do a check across the world, whichever country, but I suspect that no country would have this kind of a break on income. So you have to understand both in terms of internally within India, from what it was till last year, the rebate was till 7 lakh, right? So if you were earning till 7 lakh, you wouldn't have to pay any taxes. And that was something that she brought in last year. This year, that has been ramped up from 7 to 12. So, that's massive spike by itself. So at one level, if you think about it, while we talk a lot about middle class, the fact is that if the average income is 2 lakh or thereabout, earning 12 lakhs is not really middle class. And that is a fact that a lot of people have difficulty accepting, that in India, the middle class is actually part of the elite, And income tax as a measure is supposed to bring about a progressive taxation, which is to say you tax the rich more so that you can support the poor. Now, if you are going to move to a culture where more and more people in the income tax itself will be exempted, one has to wonder then who's getting taxed then? Because more and more burden will then fall on GST, which is a regressive tax because it's an indirect tax and everybody pays the same GST, the rich man and the poor man. So it is more regressive. So those are the other macro questions. But by itself, this is a massive tax bonanza. And as things go, this should actually make people very happy, especially those who pay taxes.
And Udit, how many people does this affect?
So the calculation is that around 1.75 crore people might be affected by this, might benefit from this, which is a small number when you think in terms of the size of this country, over 140 crores. But that is part of the problem, that we don't have a big enough tax base in terms of income tax. How many people pay income tax? And one way that economies actually provide some kind of a relief on income tax is that if you have a big enough tax base over the years, if you put in efforts to widen the tax base, you can then bring down the tax rates. You can make the income taxation progressive by giving relief. I'm not saying that you should not give relief. The whole idea of income tax is that you give progression, charge the richer more and poorer less. But you can do that more effectively if you can have a bigger tax base. Right now, it seems more like a ploy to just throw everything at the problem that the economy is not growing and there's the resentment is bubbling over in a very vocal section of the society. And it seems targeted to addressing that kind of, dousing that fire more than anything else.
Right. And the problem at hand was that the economy is not growing because people are not spending. So now the question is, will this move, which affects some 1.75 crore people, how much of this will help India grow? You said we are growing at some 6% right now. To what extent will it help us grow at, say, 8%?
Yeah. So, just to be sure that we are growing at less than 5% since 2019. So that's again something that a lot of listeners have to just pause and ponder over, that on an average level, we are growing at less than 5%. And we have to actually trigger ourselves to something closer to 8, right? That kind of a thing. Now, first of all, the total tax foregone by the government by this measure is 1 lakh crore. So that's no small number. It's a huge number, 1 lakh crore. And so 1 lakh crore, that money will, suppose all of that money is spent, then there is something called a multiplier in economics, which is to say how much would a particular move lead to rise in GDP. So the multiplier for this kind of an income tax cut is 1.01, which is roughly, if you've given a 1 rupee tax break, GDP will go up by 1 rupee. It won't go up necessarily tomorrow or day after. Depending on how it is used, it will go up by the same amount. So we can expect that India's GDP will go up by 1 lakh crore. Now, what is India's GDP at present? It is 324 lakh crore. So even if tomorrow all the money is spent, then India's GDP will go up by 1 lakh crore when it is already 324 lakh crores. So you can understand the relative effect that way. And will that be enough to trigger a growth cycle? The other thing is whether this money is going in a manner or being spent in a manner in an economy which is ready for growth. So apart from the consumption bit, which was a massive problem, the economic survey further underlined the fact that the government has got into the way of how businesses work. There's a trust deficit that the economic survey talked about. So the point is being made. And as you also noted, that India is households are getting indebted. So all of these things matter on how the money is going to be used. When the corporate tax cut was given, the companies basically used that tax cut. Instead of investing, they paid off their debt.
So are you saying that there is a chance that instead of spending this money, people could end up saving this money or paying off their loans?
Exactly. There is a chance, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Even saving the money or paying off your debt will help matters. It will bring down interest rate because if the money goes back to the financial system, the banks can then lend that money at a lower rate of interest. So it will all be beneficial. There is no per se, giving this tax break will not have a negative effect per se. Apart from the fact that if everybody suppose got out in the market and started importing stuff, then our current account deficit will worsen. Or even if we suppose tomorrow everybody went to the mall and spent all this money, then there might be a blip, increase in inflation. But I mean, keeping those theoretical arguments aside, overall, it's going to have a salutary effect on the economy. But will that trigger a growth process is not necessarily clear. And this is where I've mentioned this thing about sequencing of reforms in my piece, that if the government had done the reverse order, that they had given the consumption boost earlier in 2019 and perhaps given the corporate tax cut now, the effects would have been very different. Because the big lesson that the government has learned in the last 5 years is that companies do not just invest because the tax rate is low or the interest rate is low. They invest when they see a valid business case. And this is one of the very basic fundamental understandings in economics, that profit motive and, business sense drives all business action.
Right. And in that sense, this tax cut is an admission that what the government did in 2019 actually did not work. But, the other thing I was thinking was that in the recent years, there has been a lot of criticisms of cash transfers, right? Especially those done by political parties. People criticize it by saying that it does not really have that kind of a multiplier effect. And it's criticized for other reasons as well. But how different is this from a cash transfer?
So I think that transmission wise, this is faster, even faster than cash transfers, although cash transfers are fast enough. But government expenditure, when government also goes through this process that we'll build a road, then we'll pay, or we'll do Narega work, and then we'll pay, all of that has a transmission delay. A tax cut has an instant. The moment you announce it, you have changed the way people are thinking. They have already calculated, okay, am I going to get 1 lakh more every year? Am I going to save 80,000 more? What will I do with that 80,000? So in terms of transmission, it's a fantastic thing. Obviously, the multiplier effects of, any of these actions is much smaller. Like, as I said, it's just roughly one. So, which means that for every rupee that you're investing, you're just getting 1 rupee, which is at one level, it's less, because if the whole argument of this government, which it has been following, is that we will push capital expenditure, because the capital expenditure multipliers are anywhere between 2 to 7, right? So you put in 1 rupee, you will get rewards of 7 or 5 or whatever, depending on what you do. This time, the government has found that last year, the Capex was, 1 lakh crore lower than, these numbers are very relevant. The capital expenditure in the last financial year was short of the budget estimates by 1 lakh crore, roughly. The next year's capital expenditure is muted. It's less than 10,000 in increase over the current financial year. So you can see that the government is now balancing that instead of doing capital expenditure as much, it's given this tax break, which is to say that whatever the good argument we had made in the previous years, that capital expenditure raises multipliers and, benefits the economy more, will now work in the reverse, that you have not done that. And that is one reason why the stock market also sort of remained flat, because while they realize that the consumption has received some boost, they also realize that Capex has sort of stalled, and there was worry on that.
And just for the benefit of our listeners who have not heard our previous episodes, but basically the reason we are talking so much about capital expenditure is because this government in the past has invested a lot in it, and capital expenditure is basically the government building bridges and roads and things like that, and which has a multiplier effect because you're building infrastructure and that's an asset, and plus you're doing that while creating jobs and putting money into the hands of people. And now, Udit, you mentioned how this tax cut will mean that the government's revenues will take a hit. Now we understand that the fiscal deficit, which is the extent to which the government will borrow money, despite this, is expected to come down further to about 4.4%. Do we take that to be a good sign? And also, how is the government making that possible? Is it doing that by reducing the capital expenditure?
So obviously, government has maintained what is called the fiscal glide path, which is to say that we are coming down, we're trying to bring down our debt to GDP ratio. Debt is the mountain of all the borrowings that you did in the past, added to the current year's borrowing. So it's all the debt that you have. And the government's idea is that we'll keep bringing down, we'll borrow only so much money every year, that this ratio keeps coming down. And to that is a fiscal glide path. And the government has stayed on that. Now, as far as the revenue hit of 1 lakh crore, government has ensured that despite this, their tax revenues will go up. That is what is projected now. That we'll know in a year's time whether that comes through or not. But their tax revenues are handsomely going up. Some people might argue that whether that is going to happen or not, but that's a question for later when we meet again a year later on this. And the government has maintained the fiscal glide path, which is a massive thing because typically whenever government does such kind of bonanzas, the borrowing level goes up. And again, the listeners should understand that when government borrows in the market, it basically competes with its own citizens, right? So the interest rate goes up. Your car loan will become costly if the government is heavily into borrowing money to fund its expenditure. If the government doesn't come to the market and just prints the money, then that money will lead to inflation, which is another way of taxing you because inflation basically reduces the value of your money. So that is also a silent tax. So either way, it's a good thing for us to know that the government is not away from the fiscal glide path, as it were. So overall, but there are things that when you start, because the most of the focus has been on the tax break. But if you look at other stories, you will find that, for example, subsidies, whatever food or fertilizer subsidies that were being given are now at a 6-year low. So you have to understand, obviously, some things are being cut in different places to accommodate for this to remain on the fiscal glide path.
And over the years, one big problem, like we discussed, has been unemployment, right? And the government in the past has tried capital expenditure as a solution for that and hoping that the private sector will invest. But is the government thinking of any other ways of creating jobs?
So there's a fair amount of the finance minister's speech that was devoted to skill development and those issues. And I think every government would be aware that with AI on the horizon, and frankly, not even on the horizon, very much part of everyday talk now, it is just a matter of time that we'll have to square up with AI and figure out what to do with our population, skill force, how to sort of make them AI ready, as it were. And so that would require a whole level of skilling. And this is a field in which, frankly, China is getting the better of US as it looks. So, it's a challenge, massive challenge. But, part of the problem with the government's approach towards unemployment is that they have denied that there is a stress. So on the face of it, yes, it is true that all the major labor-related metrics have improved. There's no denying that. But we have to understand where are the new jobs being created. If some of the pieces that I've written explain that the new jobs that are being created are essentially in the form of more and more women coming into the workforce, trying to do very menial, low paying jobs, jobs of the nature where the wife joins the husband in a enterprise, which is maybe selling something in a kiosk somewhere. And those jobs don't pay much. So while the number of jobs and the percentage of jobs might be going up, the quality of jobs is a massive issue. So the important thing also is to understand that it's not just about growth. It's about how employment related, employment intensive growth. Otherwise, you will have a problem of a social unrest kind. And finance minister did mention these, that they want to push for a growth which is employment centric. So they've been trying to incentivize companies again by giving some kind of, defray some expenses, say that, okay, we'll give you some amount of money if you employ. So that element, government is now, I think, acutely aware. I think the Lok Sabha results of 2024, where BJP lost 1/5 of its seats, also was very central in bringing home the point that, not everything is hunky-dory.
And since you mentioned China, China's dominance has been a threat to India's economy. And we know that 1/3 of all global production happens in China. And you also mentioned AI. And we found out this month, with DeepSeek, that China is going head to head with US in that field. And, I suppose the truth is that if we want India to grow, we'll need people who can not only do manual work and work in the service industry, but also people who have more technical skills. And that way we can build our manufacturing industries, for example, which can then help us with exports. And one of the things we'll need for that is for children and young adults to have better education. Now, we discuss this every year, but did we see any big investments in the education sector?
So on education, I don't think there's a very clear roadmap or understanding of what needs to be done. The finance minister has talked about national centers of excellence for skilling, and that should help matters. But I think there's more focus on some more seats in IITs. I think what India needs is a much more focused understanding of how to use your human resources, what to teach them, where to fit in. So there's a need for a clarity about where to take your human resources in the global economy. And that element is lacking. The budget allocations also, one way to see the seriousness of budget allocations is not just to see what the government is announcing, what it will spend next year, is also to look at what government did in the current financial year, because the budget gives both the figures. And so one good way to look at these matters is to see what the government said last year about what will it spend this year and what the revised estimates are. And if you look at education, the revised estimates are lower than the budget estimates that were given last year. So effectively, the government has actually not gone through with the whole expenditure, which is quite remarkable for an economy which is essentially about young people, wanting to find jobs, relevant jobs. On the other hand, other side of the picture is the fact that the industry keeps saying that we don't find people employable, we don't get skilled people. So we have substantial training costs. And this all adds up to that question that a lot of people keep asking, that what more can the government do, right? So everything doesn't necessarily have to be just about expenditure. It's also about how to use that money, where to use that money, or are you throwing money at a thing which is genuinely going to solve problems. So those elements, those gaps need to be sorted out, So that element has to be there. I don't think that clarity comes out in the budget as yet.
And Udit, the other big announcement we heard was the creation of a committee that will look into regulatory reforms that are required to make it easier for companies and entrepreneurs to do business in India. How significant would you say is this move?
So to my mind, this was possibly the most important proposal in the budget, and at the same time, a very depressing one, because this government has been in power for 11 years. For it to now announce that we'll have a committee which will then look into what needs to be deregulated, and the committee will now take 1 full year to decide what needs to be deregulated. And so you can imagine that it will come into, even if suppose we think that everything will be accepted, it will take 2 years perhaps or 3 years for it to perhaps show up, which is closer to the end of this term. That's really unfortunate. The important thing to remember is that the BJP government and the Prime Minister Narendra Modi got a mandate unlike anybody post-economic reforms. It was the first government post-economic reforms which had a full single-party majority. And it had 10 years to do that, to do whatever agenda you want to do. Another thing that is very important to understand is that unlike the US system, because you hear about Donald Trump signing so many executive orders, their system is far more fractured, where the executive has to sign executive orders, but ultimately the power to legislate lies with the Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and they can actually deny many of those things. In India, the parliamentary system gives immense power to the executive because it is part of the legislature, so they can actually pass a lot of laws. So if after 11 years the government doesn't know what deregulation is required, that's in itself unfortunate. And it is sad that it has taken them 11 years to realize that a fair amount of deregulation was required. The economic survey that came out was heavy on this. It said that, if the government doesn't get out of the way in that sense, we can face economic stagnation. And remember, the Prime Minister Modi came to power with the promise of deregulation. As the reformist Chief Minister of Gujarat, that was his calling card, that everybody was assured that, when he comes to power and is given a solid majority, he will actually make those changes that we typically could not in a coalition era politics, right? That is a sad aspect, that even after 11 years of a strong government, we still are wondering what needs to change. And I suppose everybody, listeners, would realize that they're in their own respective offices, in their own respective sectors, there's a lot of reform that can happen. How is it that after 11 years, the government is still not clear what those reforms are?
And now in this budget, we also saw that the government has not lost sight of the upcoming elections in Bihar this year. The finance minister announced the setting up of a Makhana board, a National Institute for Food Technology, expansion of IIT Patna, among several other things. Now, we understand that governments feel the need to appease its voters and win elections. But can we see these sort of politically driven initiatives unfair to other states?
So there are two things I would like to say. One is that old joke, what does a politician stand for? And the answer is re-election. And there's an old proverb which says that it is the door that creaks that gets the oil. A democracy is based on that principle. It's about lobbying, It is considered, lobbying will sound like a bad word in this context, but democracy is about people coming together and voicing their demands and choosing a government which will then go through and do it. So at one level, if Bihar is getting that as part of the coalition government in the center, Bihar will, or Bihari people will say, well, it is just, we are propping up the government in the center. It will fall if we don't help this matter. So our needs should be addressed. That's part of the deal. And one could argue that as the elections go around the country, perhaps all development will happen in that electoral fashion. But of course, it is at a national level sad and unfortunate that this is how things happen. We should have had a more well thought out strategy. But then this is again not something new. I mean, all previous governments are guilty of basically, as I said, the coalition politics has always come in the way of any clear thinking policy making.
And finally, Udit, the other announcement that got a lot of attention was the Prime Minister's Dhan Dhanya Krishi Yojana that will cover 100 districts with low productivity, moderate crop intensity, and below average credit parameters. And this move is expected to benefit some 1.7 crore farmers. Now, in the past, we've discussed that for a growing economy like India, it actually makes sense for the government to move a chunk of people out of farming because it's not very remunerative. Has this government made efforts to do that over the years?
No, actually, this government's record, when historians look back at this era, they will actually find what has been pointed out, that for the first time since we started growing as an economy and as an independent country, the idea was that the phrase is structural transformation of the economy, where people in a country which was predominantly into agriculture population will shift to industry and services. In India, in the last few years, as I mentioned about the manufacturing jobs coming down since 2016 and stuff, we've seen the first time a retrograde reversal of that process of structural transformation, where people actually left other sectors and went into agriculture. And if this was not bad enough, the worst part was that this government actually celebrates that bit. Recently, one of the ministers said that, it's such a great thing that, agriculture, more people came into agriculture, that agriculture jobs increased more than in the previous government. Now, that is, again, not understanding you can have data, but not reading it correctly. It actually shows distress, right? And these schemes, again, per se, there is nothing wrong with the scheme because it's trying to, improve some issue. There are districts where productivity might be low and you're trying to target that. So again, I don't want to criticize a scheme which is per se a decent scheme or well-intended scheme. But again, it is a tacit acceptance that there are more people going to now agriculture area. And now we are looking at, even the economic survey thinks of agriculture as a growth opportunity. Now, obviously, agriculture is an important thing. You have to eat. So you must have self-reliance on that, and you must be robust and secure on that. But agriculture is not the growth area for India. We are a young country with lots of human resources. We need to find there are other things that we need to do to become a giant. Agriculture will not make us giant. It will feed us, right? But it's not the thing where we can excel and grow fast. So the bigger problem is not just that the people have moved back to agriculture. The bigger problem is that some in the government, or, if the view in the government is that it's a great thing, that more people have there and more jobs are getting created in agriculture. Again, it's a lack of understanding of what kind of jobs are good jobs.
And so finally, Udit, what is your upshot? What is your overall take on this budget?
Well, see, the good thing is that at least the government has accepted, whether they openly say that or not, there is obviously a reconsideration that has started since last year, that we need to be aware of the employment aspects of it, and that there is a consumption slowdown and we need to address that. Maybe right now they have addressed the income tax is perhaps the worst way of addressing that consumption slowdown. We had talked about this in the past, that a GST cut, because GST is more regressive and more wider, it would have had a bigger multiplier effect, right? Income tax necessarily would not have done as much, but, all said and done, income tax does provide some kind of a fillip. It's a 1 lakh crore hit that the government is taking. But the larger point still remains, now that 5 or 6 years have gone by, is that are the mechanics of India's growth story, are they in place? One fillip of economic activity through tax cuts is definitely going to be salutary and it will help. But has enough been done, or is enough being thought of in terms of the way India grows to increase the growth rate? Just throwing money has its limitations. And, to be fair, there is a very good chance that all of this does kickstart a virtuous process. But if it was only throwing money to giving money to people was the solution to India's problems, then all the welfare schemes of Lakpati Didis and Ladli Behnas and all of those schemes, that money accounts for something like 3 to 4 lakh crores in the last 1 year, 2 years that state governments have given across the board, all parties. Now, if it is only 1 lakh or 2 lakh or 3 lakh crores that will regenerate India's economy, then that would have done it, So an additional 1 lakh crore will not perhaps make such a big difference until unless we change the mechanics of how India grows. The deregulation part that Economic Survey talked about, how many sectors are struggling with not being able to achieve the real potential of their growth. Everybody in their own sector can sort of pause and wonder, could we be growing at a faster rate? Can companies be started and closed down sooner? Can they get financing sooner, easier? Can dispute resolution happen sooner, easier? All of those questions, they may not necessarily require so much money, but they need to be sorted out if India wants to go to a higher trajectory.
You were listening to 3 Things by the Indian Express. Today's show was written and produced by me, Shashank Bhargav, and was edited and mixed by Suresh Pawar. If you like the show, then do subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also recommend the show to someone you think will like it, share it with a friend or someone in your family. It's the best way for people to get to know about us. You can tweet us at Express Podcasts and write to us at podcasts@indianexpress.com.